In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural sci-fi fan blade or air vent. And yes, this is actually a procedural material, so it's not a 3D model of a fan blade. The only thing that you're going to need is a plane that is subdivided. So I've added these other objects here just to make the scene look nice, but really all you need is a plane that's been subdivided so that we have geometry for the displacements to work. So we're going to be creating the entire fan blade or air vent procedurally using the procedural nodes, and we're going to be using the node editor displacements to actually make the fan blades be displaced down into the mesh. And we're also going to be using the adaptive displacements so that if the camera is closer up to the fan, then it will be higher resolution, but then where it's farther away, it'll be less resolution. And then after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node with all of these different sliders. So we'll have the scale to change the entire scale of the material. We also have the number of blades, so if you want more or less blades, you can easily change that. Then we also have the blades rotation, and so if you wanted to animate the blades, you could actually animate this value or just rotate it around. And then we also have two different colors for the metal. So we have the color of the metal around the blades, and then we also have the blades color. Then we also have just the bolt scale and also just the noise scale, so the little bit of noise on the metal. Then we also have the roughness of the metal. Then we also have the bump strength, so if you want to make that metal look a bit more bumpy, you can. And then we also have the displacement strength, and so that'll actually control the strength of the displacement. If you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, then you can do that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, then you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And also, after you watch this tutorial, if you'd like to watch some other sci-fi metal tutorials which are similar to this, then some other videos that you might want to check out is my procedural sci-fi panels material, also my procedural sci-fi plating, and some other procedural metal tutorials. Links will be in the description to those videos if you'd like to check them out. So before we create the procedural material, let me just show you what I have set up in the 3D space if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So as I mentioned earlier, the only geometry that you really need is a subdivided plane. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to Mesh, and I can add a plane. And then you can press the Tab key to go into edit mode and just press the A key to make sure the entire mesh is selected. And then you can use the Object Context menu and then click on Subdivide. And then after you subdivide the mesh, right behind me there is the Subdivide Settings. You can just click on that tab there to open it up, and you can turn up the number of cuts. And I'm going to turn my number of cuts to 32. I think that is a pretty good resolution. But then we'll also be adding a subdivision surface modifier with the adaptive displacements to give the object more geometry. And then I can tab to go back to object mode. Now the default primitive objects are a little bit big when you're modeling to the real life scale in Blender. So I'm just going to scale this object down by 0.5 so it's just half the size. And then I will press Ctrl A and I'm just going to apply the scale. So this is now the object's new default size. And then if you want to add some geometry to the sides, you can press the Tab key to go into edit mode, and you can hold down the Alt key and select the loop on the edge, and then you can hold down the Shift and Alt key and select all the other loops on the edge. So I'm just going to select those loops, and then I can press E to extrude, hit Z, bring it down on the Z axis. And then I also just added another plane here, and this is just to give kind of a dark background. And then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And if you want to make the camera render a square image, then you can go right up here to the output properties, and you can make sure the X and Y resolutions are the same. Now for the lighting, I went over here to the world properties and I added a new world, and then right here on the color, I clicked on the yellow dot and I added an environment texture. And then I clicked on the open button and I added in the Machine Shop 02 HDRI from polyhaven.com, links in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. And then I also set the strength to 0.8 so it's a little less strong. And then I also added this area light right here, and I just pointed the area light down on the objects, and this area light is a white color with a power of 50. And then also to make the render look a bit nicer, if you click right here on the render properties and go to the color management, you can use the view transform of filmic, and you can change the look to high contrast just to pop out the colors and make everything more contrasty and saturated. Now I also want to turn on the settings settings for the displacements. So if you want to use the displacements, then you will need to be using the cycles rendering engine. And then I'm going to be using the adaptive displacements, and so that way it's going to add more geometry where the camera is closer up. So if you want to use the adaptive displacements, you'll need to set the feature set here to experimental. So then to add the adaptive displacements, just make sure you select the object, and then you can go right over here to the modifier properties, and you can click on add modifier, and you can add the subdivision surface modifier, and this is going to give the object more detail. Now you can see that the edges are kind of smooth. Now we did subdivide the object, but here on the edges you can see it is still a little bit smooth, and that is because we want to change the Catmull Clark instead to simple. So this way it'll still subdivide the mesh, but it won't change the shape of the geometry. And then if you turned on the experimental mode, there's going to be the adaptive subdivision, and you can just check mark this to turn it on, and I will just leave the dicing scale at 1. So now we can click right over here to go to the shading workspace. And so I have the 3D viewport right here, and I'm going to go into the rendered mode, and then I have the shader editor right here. Now for this plane on the background, this is just a very simple material, so I just turned the metallic value up to make it look like metal, and then here on the base color I just made this like a dark gray color. So we can now click on the object here, and I can click on new to add a new material, and I can just rename the material to air vent or fan blade. Now there is one more really important displacement setting that we need to turn on to get the displacements to work on the material. So click right over here to the material properties, and you're going to scroll down and you're going to open up the settings. And then right here under surface on the displacement here, we want to change this to displacement and bump, and this way we're telling the material that it can use the displacements. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit and you can go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-on tab you can just search for Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So the first thing that I want to create is the fan blades. So to do that, I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go to the search, and I can search for the gradient texture. Let's drop the gradient down here, and then you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object, and that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler add-on. So I'm just going to preview the gradient texture. And then also with the gradient selected, I'm going to press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector of the mapping, and so the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then the mapping node is going to be used to change the entire scale of the material. Now if you take a look at the material in the rendered mode, you can see that it starts out as black and then turns to white, and that is the gradient from the gradient texture. But I want to click on the linear right here, and I'm going to instead change this to radial. So this way it's going to start white over here, and then it's going to go around and get darker. And so we're going to use this gradient to create the fan blade. Now I don't just want one fan blade, I want many of them. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the math node. And let's drop the math node right here after the gradient texture. And then on the add right here, let's click on this, and we're going to go to functions, and we're going to add multiply instead. And then just for now, I will turn the value to 1. Now to get many fan blades, I'm going to click on the multiply, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here after the first one. And then this second multiply, I'm going to click on this to change it, and under rounding, I'm going to choose fraction. So now that these two math nodes are set up, I can turn up the value, and you can see as I turn up the value, it's going to add more and more of the fan blades. And so we can use this value here to determine how many fan blades we want. So I'm going to turn this to a 20 because I think 20 looks pretty good, but you can change this to your liking. Now later on, I also want a value which can actually rotate the fan. So what I'm going to do is click on this fraction here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to stick it in between the two math nodes. And then this fraction here, I want to click on this, and under functions, I just want to change this to add. And then on the default value here, on the bottom value, I can just turn that to 1. But now if I turn up the value, you can see it's just going to rotate the fan around, and so that is exactly what I want. So I can now use this value to animate the fan if I want to rotate it, and then this one is used to determine the amount of fan blades. So all of these 4 nodes here, these are the fan blade nodes. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all these nodes, and then I can press Ctrl J, and that will join them together into a frame. And then you can click on the frame, and you can press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this blades. You don't have to use the frames if you don't want to, but I just want to add the frames to keep my nodes nicely organized. I can also box select these nodes right here, and I can press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and then with the frame selected, you can press F2, and I can rename this to mapping. Alright, so I now want to create a texture to tell the fan blades where they're going to start and where they're going to end. So to do that, I'm actually just going to select this gradient texture, and I'm going to press Ctrl Shift D. So Ctrl Shift D will duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wire plugged up. And then I can press Alt P with that gradient texture selected to bring it out of the frame. And then I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. Now this one, I want to click on the radial, and I want to change this instead to spherical. So now in the very center, it's going to be fully white, but then as it goes out, it's going to get darker and darker. Now I do want to control the colors better because it's very faded and you can't see it very well. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after this gradient. And then I can drag these values together, and if I drag them together, it's going to be more contrasty. So now you can see we have that circle texture. So what I'm going to do is bring this white tab over to about here, and then bring the black tab over so that this part here is a bit smaller. And you can see the fading in between the black tab and the white tab. That's going to determine the fading right in between here. So that's going to control how sharp it is. So I just want to make this really small, something like that. But then I also want to add another circle on the outside here. So I'm going to hold down the Control key and click right here, and that's going to add another tab. And then I can also go to the white area and hold down the Control key and click again, and that's going to add another tab. And then this white tab here, I can drag this over, and I'm going to drag it to the other side. So now we have 2 black tabs and then 2 white tabs. So I can now use this one to create the second circle. And so wherever it's black, that's where you're going to be able to see the fan blades. But then wherever it's white, that's where it's just going to be the rest of the metal. So I can make this a bit smaller, something like that. I could also bring this over if I want to make that inner part a little bit smaller. So I can now click and drag to box select these 2 nodes, and I can press Ctrl J just to join them together into a frame and keep them nicely organized. And with the frame selected, I can press F2, and I can just rename this to circle. So the last texture that I want to add is some bolts. So let's press Shift A. I can go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, and let's put the Voronoi up here. And then I want this mapping to be able to control the scale of the entire material. So I want the vector to be going into the vector of the Voronoi. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. Now the Voronoi texture is going to add a bunch of dots, but you can see the dots are kind of randomly placed. So I'm going to turn the randomness value all the way to 0. And then also on the scale here, I want to drag this up a bit so there are a bit more of them. And specifically, I'm going to use a value of 5.56. So we're going to use all those little dots to create the bolts on the metal. Now you can see that they're fading a lot, and I want them to be much sharper. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the color ramp node, and let's put the color ramp after the Voronoi. So I can now drag the white tab over, and you can see that's going to make it much more contrasty. And I can also drag the black tab over a little bit. So I'm going to bring the white tab way over to about here, and then I'll also bring the black tab to about there. So now you can see we just have some little bolts on the object. So I'm now going to click and drag just to box select these nodes, and I can press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and then with the frame selected, I can press F2, and I want to rename this to bolts. So you can now see we have our bolts texture, our circle texture, and then our blades. So we can now join them all together. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix node. Let's just drop the mix node here. And then I want to click on the float here, and I want to change this instead to color because we are working with color values. And I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So we're now going to join the circle and the bolts together. So let's take the circle color, and I'm going to put that into B. And then I want to take the bolts color ramp, and I actually want to put that into the factor. So the factor is going to control where it's going to be value A and where it's going to be value B. Now value A here, this is going to be the color of the bolts because we are putting the bolts color ramp into the mix. And then B is just going to be the circle. So I'm just going to make this kind of like a light gray on color A. And the hex value that I'll be using for color A is going to be 868686. box. So now we have our circle texture with some bolts, but wherever the dark part of the circle is, that is where the fan blades are going to be, and so I don't want to be able to see any of the bolts where the black part is. I just want to be able to see the bolts kind of here around the metal, but not on the black area. So I'm going to click on this mix here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here after the first one. And then I want to take the mix here, and I want to make sure that is going into color A. And just make sure you Control Shift and select this mix to preview it. So I now want to take the circle here, this color ramp here on the circle, and I want to take the color and I want to put that into color B. And then I just want to add the dark values. So let's click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to darken. So now I can turn this factor value all the way up to 1, and it's going to get rid of the bolts which are in the dark area. And we set this to darken, so it's just adding the dark values. So it's basically just overlaying the black circle over the bolts. So just turn the factor all the way up to 1, and now you can just see the bolts here and there. Now I also want to add in the texture of the blades into the black area. So I'm going to bring this over, and I'm going to click on this first mix node here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate, and let's stick it here after the darken. And then I want to take the darken, and I actually want to put that into the factor, and then I want to take the blades texture, I want to take the fraction here, and I can put that into color A. So again, the factor is going to control what parts are going to be A and what parts are going to be B. And if I Control Shift and select the darken, wherever it's black, that's where it's going to be adding color A, and then wherever it's white, that's where it's going to be adding color B. So I can Control Shift and select the mix, and you can now see that we can just see the fan texture in that dark area. And then right here on color B, I'm just going to make this fully white. So this texture is the texture that we're going to add into the displacements. So let's take the mix here, and I want to take the result, and we want to put that into the displacement of the material output. And then if for some reason the displacements aren't working, you should go back to the starting of this video with the timestamps in the video timeline and make sure that you added all of the displacement settings. So you can see it's displacing the mesh, but it looks really weird. It's kind of jutting off to the side here, and that is because this is color data, but this is displacement data. So we need a node in here to convert the color data into displacement data. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node. And let's put the displacement in between the mix and the material output. And then we can take the result here, and I'm going to put that into the height value. And this way it'll convert it to displacement data. Now that is way too strong, so just for right now, I'm going to turn the scale to like a 0.1, but we can change that later if we want to. Now you can see that the texture is really black, and that's because I need to take the principled shader and I need to put that into the surface of the material output. And then I can drag the principled shader up here, and I'm actually going to drag the displacement down and kind of bring this down a bit. So now you can see that the displacement is actually displacing the mesh, and it looks like a fan blade. And then because the adaptive displacements is turned on, if the camera is closer up, it'll render this area with more detail. And to actually see the adaptive displacements updating, what you can do is select the object, and then you can just double tap the tab key. So that'll basically take you into edit mode and then take you back to object mode, and so it'll just update the mesh. So I can zoom closely, double tap the tab key, and you can see now that has much higher quality. And also when this renders, it is going to use much more geometry. Now I want to be able to see this a little bit better because it is very white, so let's turn the metallic value all the way up to 1, and then right here on the base color, for now I can just make this kind of like a dark gray color so you can see it better. So now you can see what the fan blade is looking like. Now the fan blades are very sharp, and so I want to make them more subtle. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the fraction, and I can drag it into the frame here. So we can now use these color ramp colors to make the blades less sharp. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag the white tab out here, and then I'm going to hold down the Control key and click right here to add another tab on the other side. And then this tab, I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to set that to fully black. So now if I kind of zoom in here, zoom over to the blade, I can double tap the tab key, and you can see now that is a bit smoother. And if you drag this over, this is going to control where the blade is starting, so where it's at its highest point. So I do want to drag this over quite a bit, so somewhere around there, and this black tab is going to make it darker as it goes down there. So basically the colors of this color ramp are controlling the shape of the fan blades, because it is black right here at the starting, and so that is going to be this area way down here, but then as it gets lighter and lighter, that's telling the displacement to displace it more and more up. So then it is fully white, and that is the part right up here on the top of the fan blade. And then right here, this black tab, that is going to make it go back down. Now these fan blades are still coming up a bit too high and they're really sharp, so I'm going to click on the white tab here and I'm going to turn this down. So you can see as I make it darker, it's going to be less strong, and so those fan blades won't come up quite as much. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, then you can go to the hex and you can punch in a hex value of C3, C3, C3. Now you can also see that those bolts are a little bit big, so if we go here to the bolts, we can go to the color ramp and we can drag this around to make the bolts bigger or smaller. So I just want to drag this back here. I'm actually going to drag this a bit farther back and then drag this over to make the bolts a bit smaller. So something like that is a little bit better. And then also right here, this is going to control the color of the bolts. So if I make this lighter, you can see the bolts are going to be less strong, or if I make it darker, it's going to be more strong with the displacements, and so the bolts are going to go back in a little bit. So I might just make this a little bit brighter, something like that. Now I also want this metal to be more shiny, so if I go back here to the principled shader, I want to take the roughness and I want to turn that down to like a 0.3, and that way the metal will be a bit more shiny. And then I also want to edit the colors, so let's take the mix here and I want to put the result into the base color. But I want to have more control over these colors, so I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the mix. And then I can Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. Now I want to have two different colors. I want to have the metal color right over here, and then I also want to have the blade color right here. So because I want to have two different colors, I can click on the linear here, and I can change it to constant. And so this way it's not going to have any blending, it's just going to be one color and then the next color, and I can just bring the white tab right over here. So we now basically have a mask where there is one metal and then the other metal. So now to make the colors, I can press Shift A, I can go to the search, and I can search for a mix node. Let's drop the mix node right up here, and then if you click on the float here, I want to change this instead to color, so it's using color values. And I can drop the mix node right here after the color ramp, but before the principled shader. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview the material. Now I actually want the color ramp color to be going into the factor, because the factor is controlling where it's going to be A and where it's going to be B. So then here on color A, I want to make this a bit darker, kind of like a dark gray, so that the fan blades are darker. And then for B here, I just want to make this kind of like a light gray. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, here on color A, I'm going to be using a hex value of 7F, 7F, 7F. And then here on color B, I'm going to be using D9, D9, D9. Now if we go back over here to the displacements still are a little bit strong, so I'm just going to turn the scale down to a 0.07. That way the displacements are a bit less strong. And you could also change the mid-level here if you want to, but I'm just going to leave the mid-level at 0.5, and I'll drag the displacement here under the shader. Now to make this look a bit more like metal, I do want to add a tiny little bit of noise into the bump. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the noise texture, and let's put the noise texture right down here. And then I can take the mapping vector, and we're going to put that into the vector of the noise texture so that the mapping can control the entire material. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to leave the scale at 5, but I will turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then also I will turn the roughness up to like a 0.6, so there's a bit more detail. So I can now take the factor, and we're going to pull out a wire here, and I'm going to drag this all the way over, and I want to stick this into the normal of the principled shader. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues and it's not working correctly, and that is because this here is black and white data, but then this here is normal data. So we need to convert it to normal data that the shader can use. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and let's drop the bump node right here before the normal. And then we actually want to put the noise texture into the height value. So now you can see it looks really bumpy. And that is way too strong, so let's make it much less strong. So I'm going to turn the strength to a 0.02, so it is much more subtle. But now you can see the metal just has a very subtle texture. And there we have it, so that is the finished material. But I'm now going to show you how to join these together into a custom node with the different custom values. So I'm going to click and drag just to box select all the nodes except the material output. And then I can press Ctrl G, and Ctrl G is going to join all the nodes together into into a node group. Now if you press the N key to open up the side panel and then click over here on group, you can see that there are some inputs and outputs. And I want to click on the BSDF, and I want to click on the arrow right here to bring it up to the top. And then if I double click on this to rename this, I can rename it just to like shader, just because I like that a bit better. So now if you press the tab key, that'll go in and out of the node group. And you can now see that the shader one is on top. So I'm going to drag this out just to make it a bit bigger, and then I can click here on the name and press Ctrl C to copy, and then click here and press Ctrl V to paste the same name. And I can also drag the material output right over here. So I can now press the tab key to go back into the node group. And right over here you can see there's a group input, and so we can add values to this to create all the different sliders. So I'm first going to take the scale from the mapping and let's put that into the group input. And then if you click right here on the input scale, I want to click on the type here, and I want to instead change this to float, and this way it's just going to use one single value. So if I press the tab key to go back out of the node group, you can see the scale is 0, so I just want to turn the scale to 1 so that it is now the default scale. So I can now tab to go back into the node group. Now the next value that I want to add is the number of blades. So we can take the multiply here, and let's take the value, and I want to put that into the extra socket here. And then I can double click on this to rename it up here on the inputs, and I can just rename this to number of blades. So number of blades. So now if I press the tab key to go out of the node group, I can just drag this around to make more or less of the blades. Let's tab to go back into the node group. So the next one that I want to add is the blades rotation. So let's take the add here, let's take the value, and I'm going to bring this over and stick it into the socket, and then I can double click on this to rename this, and I want to rename it to blades rotation. So we can now add the different color values. So I'm actually just going to click on the group input, and I'm going to drag this over just so it's a bit easier to see. And then I can take the mix here, and I want to take A, and I want to put that into the socket, and also B, and put that into the socket. And then I can just rename these. So right here on A, I want to rename this to blades color, and then right here on B, I want to rename this to metal color. And then I actually want the metal color to be on top. So if you click on the metal color, you can click on the arrow here to bring it up to the top. And then I can drag the group input right back up here. So I now want to add the bolt scale and the noise scale. So let's take the Voronoi scale here, and I can put that into the extra socket, and then I can click on this to rename it, and I want to rename this to the bolt scale because it's controlling the Voronoi. And then I can drag this down here. Let's bring it down back here to the bottom, and I can take the noise texture scale, and let's put that into the socket, and then right here I can just rename this to noise size or noise scale. Now I also want to be able to control the roughness of the metal, so let's take the roughness here from the principled shader, and I can drag this all the way over. You can kind of push over to move the view, and I want to stick it here into the extra socket, and you can see it's already called roughness. And the two other values that I want to add are the bump strength and the displacement strength. So let's take the bump here, I can take the strength, and let's drag this over, and I can stick it in here, and I can just rename this, double click on it, and I'm going to rename it to bump strength. And then the last one here, if I take the displacement, I can take the scale, and I can bring this over and stick it into the other socket here, and then I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to displacement strength. And I can now press the tab key to go out of the node group. So we now have the scale to change the entire scale of the material. We also have the number of blades and also the blades rotation. So you can animate this value if you want to animate the blades. And then you can also change both of the metal colors. And I actually think red looks kind of cool. There's also the blades colors. You can change that. And there's also the bolt scale to just change the size of the bolts and also just the noise scale. And then you can also control the roughness of the metal, and then you can control the bump strength, and finally the displacement strength. So that is it. That is how you turn this into a custom node with all of the different sliders. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support this channel, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And if you like creating procedural sci-fi metal materials, then I will also have some links in the description to these other procedural metal materials here that I've created on my channel. You can check those out with the link in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.